Restored began with a vision to see a world where women live free from the fear of violence. Mandy and Peter, our co-founders, felt God was asking, where is the church and where are the men when it comes to ending violence against women and girls? Restored began working internationally to raise awareness and to equip the church to respond to violence against women and girls. We began the First Man Standing campaign, equipping men to challenge and change a culture whilst demonstrating a better way to live. Over the years, we recognised that the form of violence that most women are likely to experience is domestic abuse. Women hurt by men who are meant to love them, and we saw that it was happening in the church too. In 2015, we launched our Survivors Network, with 7 women forming a community where they could share their experience and their faith. The next year, we developed the Church Pack to help churches end domestic abuse. A copy of the pack was distributed to every denomination in the UK. We kept researching to understand how churches were recognising and responding to domestic abuse. We discovered that 1 in 4 churchgoers had experienced domestic abuse, demonstrating just how crucial our mission is. Meanwhile, the Survivors Network was growing. We noticed that members often had the same questions about recovery and faith, so we gathered a team of experts to develop the Survivors Handbook, a comprehensive guide to help survivors navigate recovery and answer the key theological questions that many were asking. Since its publication, thousands of handbooks have been distributed to survivors across the globe. Lockdown changed everything. We realised that survivors needed more access to community, so we launched online groups to bring women together. We also took our training online, and individuals from churches across the world continue to join to learn more about responding to domestic abuse. What we were doing through the Survivors Network was transforming women's lives, and we began dreaming of what that could look like in local communities. The Restored Beacon Network was founded, and the first church signed up to join. Restored continued to work internationally and began to host the Christian Network to End Domestic Abuse, sharing resources and equipping the global church. Nearer to home, we ensured our resources were relevant for churches in each of the 4 nations of the UK and Ireland, and updated the Survivors Handbook to cover new issues facing survivors. The Survivors Network continued to grow, and we began an annual retreat to bring together women who had previously connected online, creating a beautiful space for women to encounter God together. Today, we continue to speak up about violence against women and girls, to equip the church to end domestic abuse and support survivors. And we'd love for you to join us as we turn our eyes to the future and continue changing the story for women.
Hopefully, that gives you a little bit of a glimpse into the work of Restored and where we come from. So my name's Bekah. I didn't found Restored, but I have the very great privilege of leading it now. And it's a work that I love to do. It's a work I wish I didn't have to do. But it's a work that is really, really important. There's 2 key things. There's community for survivors of domestic abuse who follow Jesus, because there are so many extra complications and difficulties and challenges trying to navigate what you're going through and what the Bible has to say about that. Where is God in the midst of this? And that space now has nearly 1,000 women in it, each reaching out for help, but each finding support in community. It's a really important thing. And then also equipping the church. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I'm here to open up God's word as well this morning. And I want to talk in particular about this concept of justice, Jesus, justice, and the marginalised. Because I think that sits at the heart of who Jesus is. It sits at the heart of what we do as Restored. Truthfully, it sits at the heart of what an awful lot of Christian organisations and churches do around the world and in this country. But I wonder what you think of when you think of that word justice. I wonder what comes to mind. I wonder if it is a picture of those scales like we see on the image there, of Lady Justice deciding how to weigh things up. Maybe you think of a court. Maybe you think of somebody being put away for doing something wrong. Maybe it's about seeing a wrong righted. Maybe you think of a great injustice that has been begun to be fixed, like, with Mr. Bates and the post office. And we see something that takes a long time and we all get invested in seeing justice brought. I wonder if it's something that we think is about getting what you deserve. We have so many different concepts. And sometimes it's really easy to think that we want justice when it suits us, when it means that we'll get good things, less so probably when we've done something wrong and would rather evade it. But the reality is justice looks like lots of different things, and justice can be complicated. I know that locally, there's been a story in the press over the last few months where we desperately wanted to see justice for something terrible that we thought had happened. And justice took a bit of a nasty form. And justice came out on the streets because we wanted to see justice more possibly than we wanted to get to the bottom of what had actually happened. But we see it everywhere. Justice is actually quite complicated, and it's actually quite difficult. And it's not straightforward. You see, I work with survivors of domestic abuse, and they have lived through huge injustice. And often, even long after they've left their abuser, the injustice continues as they're being dragged through family courts, where sometimes justice doesn't happen. Sometimes they lose everything and there isn't a way of fixing it. One of the worst parts of my job is sometimes sitting with women and saying, you might have to let go of justice in order to find real freedom. Because for so long as justice is what's going to make your world better, you might never get better. Because we live in a broken world where injustice sometimes dominates. And we see that all over the world, don't we? We see that in the Middle East at the moment. We see that perhaps in Gaza. Now, I don't want to get horribly political in the middle of this, but they have been experiencing a bombardment for the last couple of years, and it's stopped now. But that doesn't mean that justice has happened. It doesn't mean there's restoration. People can't just go home because their homes aren't there anymore. It's not straightforward. It's hard. So as we think about these concepts, as we think about justice, I want us to think about Jesus, and I want us to think about what the Bible has to say. And we're going to dip around a couple of places and then settle in to a story of Jesus. But I want to start by trying to understand what justice is. And so the first verse I want to look at is found in the book of Jeremiah, who was a prophet, passing on God's word to God's people. And he says this, or he records God as saying this, "Thus says the Lord, do justice and righteousness, and deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who has been robbed. And do no wrong or violence to the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, nor shed innocent blood in this place." And what we begin to see here is that justice is something more than a concept. It's something more than we get or we receive. Justice is something that we do, and it goes hand in hand with righteousness. These two things are inextricably linked. But also the marginalised are begun to be outlined here as well. In fact, we can see it here. They say the marginalised, so those who've been oppressed. Well, that can be for all manner of reasons, can't it? And then he goes on and says the resident alien, which is a phrase we probably wouldn't use today to describe people. But we might actually say, well, we do have different phrases: asylum seekers, immigrants. Sometimes we want to call them illegal immigrants. We have different names for it, but actually God says, do justice to these people, the fatherless, the widow. Now, that's all manner of people in our society, isn't it? And a widow, I think we could extend that phrase to go beyond somebody who's, lost their husband or their wife to death, but actually maybe to divorce, maybe because of domestic abuse. We can think of those, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of single parents struggling to make ends meet, struggling to cope alone, feeling isolated, feeling separate. And then in the book of Job, we see that definition extended even further. And for those of you who aren't so familiar with who Job was, he was a man who was renowned for doing good, for being somebody who tried to do what God wanted him to do all the time, and yet to whom terrible things happened. He lost his entire family. He became terribly ill. He lost all that he owned. And as he's crying out at the injustice of that, this is what he says. He says, I delivered the poor who cried and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the wretched came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. So we can already see there some of those things that were mentioned in Jeremiah. He says, I put on righteousness and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. He says, I was just. I was good. I looked after those who had nothing. And he continues, I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I championed the cause of the stranger. He defines this justice. He defines this righteousness as stepping in and filling in the gaps. Eyes to the blind, feet to the lame, father to the needy, championing the cause of the stranger whose voice isn't heard. That's justice. That's where we see Jesus. That's where we see God. So fundamentally, when we talk about justice, there are 4 key things here. And the first one is the one that we're perhaps most comfortable with, this idea of fair consequences. We want to see punishment for wrongs. We want to see people rewarded for doing good things. That makes us feel like that everything is right with the world. But there's something else here that we picked up in those words of Job. And that's a word called equity. And equity is a funny word that sometimes is about finance, but in this instance isn't. And it's helpful to understand it as slightly different to equality. You see, equality is making sure that everybody has access to the same things. It's providing everybody with the same resources or opportunities, so everybody gets the same thing. But equity is when we recognize that just putting those resources out doesn't mean everyone can access them. It's about stepping in and providing some people with that extra help, the extra scaffolding, the extra something that they need to access the same resource. So even this morning in this room, I've loved watching the signing and all that's going on here at the front of the church. Because if I came to speak and everyone's allowed to walk through the door, that's equality. But the fact that a whole team of brilliant people have been brought in to help the deaf community access this same resource, well, that's equity. Because we've given people that opportunity to access the same thing as everybody else. Everybody could have walked through the door. That was equality. Equity is making sure everyone can access it completely. That's right. And restoration is in there with justice too, literally enabling people to have what has been taken from them. And sometimes I think that is the hardest bit about justice, is bringing that in, bringing it, enabling people to be restored to what God originally intended, which isn't always the same thing as having what you used to have. In God's kingdom, in kingdom culture, restoration is about being restored to who you were created to be. And part of that is about right relationship with those around us, right relationship fundamentally with God. And this is where I want to dip into one of the stories that we know about the life of Jesus when he walked on earth, because he demonstrated this again and again and again and again. But this story shows it in real time, what was going on and what justice can look like for us. You see, if we think about justice being an action and not just a concept, we can have to think about, well, what does that mean for me? Not how do I get justice, but how do I do justice? How do I bring justice to those around me? And here's the thing, we sometimes see the easy things, like the big things, like, petitioning Parliament for justice, perhaps, or running an organisation like Restored, or running a recovery group, or running a whatever it is that it looks like. It might look like going on a protest march. It might look like not buying your things from certain shops because they're unethical. It can look like all manner of things. But what about our everyday life? There's so many choices of stories that we could pick up from the life of Jesus, but this is the one that I particularly want us to pick up on. And this story begins with an important man with a pressing need. Now, really crucially, this is not a story about a terrible crime. We're not talking about that type of justice, but instead it's a story about real people. It's a story about humanity, and it's a story about societal expectations. So we pick up this story in the book of Luke. Chapter 8, verse 40. And it tells us this: now, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And just then there came a man named Jairus. He was the leader of the synagogue, and he fell at Jesus' feet and he begged him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, who was dying. So here we are, this very important local dignitary, the leader of the synagogue, somebody who was looked up to and respected, coming to Jesus and asking for help for something that would have mattered to him, I should think, more than almost anything in the world, because his daughter is dying. And then something else happens, because as he went, the crowds pressed in on him. This is talking about Jesus. And it says that there was a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. And though she'd spent all that she had on physicians, no one could cure her. And so along comes another woman or another person with a pressing need. She's been ill for 12 years. She would be utterly exhausted. Imagine how anemic she would be if she's been bleeding non-stop for all of that time. But beyond the physicality of what is making her, not needing Jesus, is something else that's easy to miss in this story. Because according to Old Testament law, according to the scriptures, this bleeding made her outcast. This bleeding meant that she couldn't participate in the religious ceremonies. She couldn't go to the synagogue. She was isolated from everybody. Anything she touched was considered unclean. She was a complete and utter outcast. This woman was ill. She was outcast. She was weak, and she was broke. And she presses in, and she comes to see Jesus too. And so at the beginning of this story, we discover two separate characters coming to meet Jesus, hoping that he can meet their needs. And on one hand, we've got, this man, Jairus. We know his name, for starters. And we know that he's a religious leader. He will have been respected. People literally followed him. They would have been his disciples. They would have listened to him, hung on every word, wanted to do what he told them to do, come to him for wisdom. And on the other hand, we have a woman whose name we never know, who was chronically ill, who was cast out, and who was ignored. Like, the difference between these two characters is extraordinary. It's so obvious who's at the center of society and who sits out on the margin. Physical weakness, disabilities, challenges leave people unable to access what most of us can. Because we can't walk the same, because we can't hear the same, because we can't see the same or talk the same, we're not able to be in the center. The margins are where so many people live. And Jesus sees them. Jesus sees you. Jesus always went to the margins, and he brought the margins in. And the truth is that if Jesus had had a PR agent at this point, I am very confident what the PR agent would have been encouraging Jesus to do at this point. He'd have been saying, right, you need to go after Jairus, because Jairus is where the action is. Jairus is where the story is. If you can heal Jairus' daughter, everybody will know. Ignore this woman. She's nobody. Get out there, get on, let's go and go to Jairus' house, because he could change things for you. This is a pivotal moment in your story, Jesus. I've been to enough events to know and to see that sometimes that's how celebrity worship leaders, celebrity speakers get treated. Special treatment, special room, special food, special transport, special everything. It's the way of the world. It's what we're kind of used to. It's not Jesus' way. You see, he wasn't a big fan of PR. He wasn't a big fan of worldly expectations. This is the man whose first visitors, when he arrived in the world, were shepherds, the lowest of the low. This is the man who invited tax collectors and fishermen to follow him. This is the man who always went out of his way to eat with the people that nobody else would, who hung out with tax collectors and with prostitutes. He was a PR nightmare. He was a PR nightmare because he just didn't care. He wasn't impressed by status or wealth or influence. And so when this woman whose name we don't know, reaches out and touches his cloak, he doesn't go after Jairus. He doesn't go to where the story will be. He stops. You see, the rich man's daughter is dying, but there's a woman here who needs more than physical healing. And Jesus sees beyond that immediate need, because justice is always more than surface level. And so this woman comes up behind, and the story continues, and we discover she came up behind him and touched the fringe of his clothes, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Immediately. And then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" And when all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd surround you and press in on you." You can imagine Peter going, "Are you kidding me? There's hundreds of people here. How can we possibly tell? Everyone's touching you in some shape or form." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed the power has gone out from me." Jesus knew. Jesus always knows. Jesus sees. He sees the things that we think nobody else sees, the good things and the bad things. He sees when we reach out for him, even when nobody else notices. He sees and he knows and he cares. And so he calls out as to see who has touched him. And the story goes on. When the woman saw that she couldn't remain hidden, she came trembling. And falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she touched him and how she'd been immediately healed. And Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." It's this beautiful moment, this snapshot of Jesus bringing justice. And it's important to think through actually just the very simple things that are so quick to read, but that spell out some of the ways that Jesus brings justice. You see, there was equity here. Because this woman could have just come, just touched the hem of Jesus' cloak, and just walked away again. And she would have been healed. But Jesus wanted more for her than that, because there's all these other people who had access to Jesus. There's all these other people who had access to society, access to community, access to the synagogue. And he realizes that healing isn't enough to give her that. He needs to do something more. And so he draws her, he calls her into the center. He moves her from the margin into the center. But he doesn't just make her. And that's something that's so important. Something we talk about a lot at Restored is that Jesus modeled time after time after time, not controlling people. He didn't make people do things. And so he invites her into his bigger story. You see, it's an invitation. It's the way that he works. He invites her in. And he says, "Who touched me?" And here's the thing. She could have slunk off at this point. She could have decided that was enough and just quietly let the crowd go on and disappear off to just have her part of the story. But Jesus invites her in. "Who touched me?" And eventually she says, "It was me. It was me." He gives her back her voice. He gives her back her status because he restores her. When he says, "Your faith has made you whole," there's a truth to that. It was her courage. It was her belief that Jesus was the answer to her problems. Truthfully, he'd healed her. It was his power. It was him, God made man, that enabled her to be healed. But he restores her by giving her back her value, giving her back her worth. He says, "I see you. I see your courage. I see your faith." And then he calls her daughter and he brings her back into relationship with him. And truthfully, puts her back into relationship with this community all around him who are following him. Because he calls her out and he gives her credit for what she did. He says, "Look at this woman. Look at her faith. Look at her courage. Look at what she did. She's my daughter." What a change. I'm so sure she was over the moon that her bleeding stopped. But the thing that changed the course of her life, "Your faith has made you whole." And he called her daughter. It was beautiful. So often we can look at the problems that people have and come up with those surface level answers. Food for people who are hungry. Money for those who've got nothing. Maybe a roof over somebody's head who's homeless. But their need goes so much deeper. Do we dare to bring people in, not just to go out to them and give them the obvious thing that they need in the obvious moment, Will we bring them into the centre? Will we call them family? Will we recognise and call out what is good in them and restore their value? It matters that we do that. And of course, Jairus isn't forgotten. He's not forgotten. Jesus has got time for everybody. It's not that he only likes those on the margins. It's not that he only likes the poor. You know, sometimes we feel like we're in a world which is set up about, well, you're either for us or you're against us. You know, when we had the whole Black Lives Matter movement, there were so many people shouting and getting upset and going, oh, you know, white lives matter too. Yes, they do. But in that moment, equity meant we needed to recognise that there was a whole community of people around the world who need extra access to justice. And sometimes we see that with women. When something terrible has happened to women and it's hit the headlines and suddenly everyone will shout and say, it's not all men. I know. But sometimes we have to highlight what is going on. It's called equity. But Jesus sees everything. He does care about black lives. He does care about white lives. He does care about the poor, and he does care about the rich. And so while he was still speaking, somebody came from the leader's house, from Jairus' house, to say, your daughter's dead. Do not trouble the teacher any longer. And when Jesus heard this, he replied, do not fear, only believe, and she will be saved, which is a nice little nod back, actually, to the faith of the woman he's just healed. And the story continues, and we'll pick it up a few verses later, because he goes to the house, and he takes this girl by the hand, and he calls out, child, get up. And she got up at once. Jesus has time for everybody. It doesn't matter who we are or where we sit. It doesn't matter if we sit right slap bang in the centre of everything that's going on most of the time, because we're just very fortunate to be in that space, or we sit on the outside. Jesus has time for all of us. There's one more thing I did want to mention, which is on the verse that's just been sitting up there, that I wanted to point out, and I've only noticed this in the last month. And I've been, reading this story in some shape or form for decades. I'm not going to tell you how many, but a lot. And I'd never noticed this, because if you read the story, and this story is told in a number of the Gospels, a number of the accounts of Jesus' life. But actually, if you look at it in the book of Mark, and then you continue reading, in the next chapter, Jesus has been walking around, he's been doing lots of different things, he's fed the 5,000, he's walked on water, and then there's this line that comes up. Wherever he went, that's Jesus, in villages, cities, or the countryside, they brought the sick out to the marketplaces. They begged him to let the sick touch at least the fringe of his robe, and all who touched him were healed. Now here's the thing, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just what people did 2,000 years ago. But maybe there was a way that because of this woman's faith, because of her courage, because Jesus invited her to share her story with the crowd, to come back into the centre, that people heard, gosh, that woman, everything changed when she touched the fringe of his cloak. Maybe her story, her nameless story, actually became something that got told again and again and again. In fact, we know it has, I'm telling it. But maybe it helped others to access Jesus, just like she did. Justice was more than the surface. It was delving deep. It was restoring relationship. It was bringing her back into God's story, back into her community, and able to help others the way that she had been helped. So, as we come in to finish, what does it mean for us? Well, I think there's two personal challenges for each of us in the room. And the first really is that we actually have to look to the margin. We have to move there. It's no good thinking about it. It's no good reading the stories and saying, wasn't Jesus brilliant? We have to think about, what does it mean for us? What does it look like to go and find those on the margins? What does it look like to bring them into the centre? I was just thinking about what Richard said after we sang that song, Oceans, about take me where I'm not comfortable anymore. Take me where the water is deep. Are we prepared to do that? Because sometimes that doesn't look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it's going to the people we didn't expect it to be. Are we prepared to do that? And when we do, how do we bring justice? Well, sometimes at Restored, we talk about being the opposite of oppression. And a story that gives an example of that is, A, what Jesus just did, But I was leading a talk about recognising and responding to domestic abuse. It's what I do most of the time. And at the end, the people in the room asked me a question. They said, there's a lady in our church, she's actually in her late 70s, and her husband has abused her for decades, all of her life. And she's in such a difficult situation. We don't know how to help her. Because she's not really at a stage of life where leaving is straightforward. Where would she go? How would she cope? This is all she's ever known. And I sat there and I thought about it. And I thought, what you're able to do is to be the opposite of her oppressor. Like, where he has put her down, you build her up. Where he's taken things away, you give things back. Where he has isolated her, you can go and give her community. Be the opposite of what has harmed her. So often that is what people need. You can give respect and dignity to people who have not found it, who have not been given it. It might be that today you're sitting in the room and you recognise yourself on the margins for a number of reasons. Quite possibly something I haven't even mentioned, but you don't feel like you belong in the centre. You feel like maybe you're somebody whom perhaps you could just about dare to reach out and touch Jesus' cloak so long as nobody saw, so long as nobody thought, what on earth do they think they're doing? Who do they think they are coming to the centre? And I want you to take away from this, not the challenges, but the invitation. The invitation to know that God sees you. Jesus knows. He knows your needs. He knows your hurts. He sees you. He loves you. And he would love to see you come into the centre of the story. He invites you into his story. And maybe that's your challenge, is to find that courage, like the woman in this story, to reach out and touch the hem of Jesus' garment and allow him to do the rest, because he would love to do that for you. And there's one more challenge for you as a church, you as a community of followers of Jesus, to think about how you do this. Now, I know you're already doing this in lots of different ways. I can see it right here. I can see it because as we were praying earlier, I was hearing about the work that you do with those struggling with addiction. All of those things, reaching out to those on the margins, inviting them to come to the centre. But at Restored, there's a very specific way that we ask churches to reach out to certain people on the margins, survivors of domestic abuse. Could you step out and reach out? Could you do that? Could you reach out to those who are struggling as single parents, to those who are struggling in marriages that harm them, to those children whose lives have been torn apart because home isn't a safe space to be? You see, as the Restored Beacon churches were in the very end of that little video clip that we talked about, but fundamentally it's how we partner with local church to help local church do what we do online, transforming the lives of women who've been abused, giving them dignity, giving them value, helping them rediscover who God created them to be, to rebuild their relationship with God and with the community all around them, to ensure they don't feel isolated anymore. And we encourage churches to be able to do that in their local community. You see, and it acts out those 4 different ways of bringing justice, because it is about consequences. Because the reality is that when we start grappling with the concept of domestic abuse happening in the church at the same rate as outside, it means we've got to ask ourselves some difficult questions. It means we have to have some difficult conversations. It means we have to admit that things aren't necessarily perfect, even within these 4 walls. It means that we've got to be prepared to hold people accountable for their actions. And it means that we need to bring equity, to give resources to those who've been abused, making sure that they can access fair outcomes, making sure they can access the things the rest of us take for granted. We can bring restoration, enabling those who've had everything taken from them, finances, home sometimes, children sometimes, value, self-worth, relationships. And we can restore that and bring that back one step at a time. And we can do that through right relationship. We can do it by welcoming people into our church family, saying, you are not alone anymore. You've got us. We will walk alongside you on this journey. We don't know all the answers, but we'll help you find them. You can find home with us because we want to bring you to the centre. Don't sit on the margins any longer. And we'll help you understand how God sees you because he loves you very much and he wants you to be in his story. So there's so much in this story. There's so much when it comes to thinking about justice. There's so much that Jesus models to us for us to take away something. So I'm going to finish by praying. But I want you to take a moment. How you might like to close your eyes. But just to stop and to think, what has God been speaking to you this morning? It might not have been through me. It might have been through the lyrics of a song or a notice or a conversation before church even began. But where have you seen God? Where have you heard God? What is he saying to you? Dear Lord Jesus, thank you that you have time for all of us. Not just the ones who get all the attention anyway, but those of us who sit on the edges, those of us who feel unseen, those of us who don't feel very important, those of us who don't feel heard. Thank you that you see us, that you know us, and that you long to bring us into your story. Father, help us to never be the gatekeepers on the centre, but to be flinging doors open left and right, to be opening up this church, our homes, our love, this church family, to those who need to find your love, to bring them in, to invite them in, to go out into the furthest places and the darkest corners and be bringing people in, to be bringing justice, to be doing justice, and to see people restored to you. Amen. Amen.